This is back in 2021. We had a raw material contamination, which led to about 60,000 litres of beer being recalled across Western Australia. It honestly nearly sunk us at the time. It was something that was pretty catastrophic, and the worst part of it was that about 2/3 of people were blind to the fault that was caused in the beer. Hey guys, how you doing? And welcome to episode 3 of Between Two Rocks, or as we might be, between about 30,000 cans. I'm here today with Drew Hennessy, who's our QA, QC and lab manager. He's also taken on a role as our safety officer and is essentially building out all of our processes and systems. He's a man who wears many hats and has a huge amount of experience running NATA accredited laboratories. So we're going to pick his brain today about what it actually takes and what it means to have a brewery quality program, and I guess just look at some of the various aspects that we cover here at Rocky Ridge and where we're trying to go in the future as we continue to develop this program. So, Drew, welcome and cheers.
Cheers.
So, I guess walk me through what we go through here at Rocky Ridge before we actually put a beer in front of a customer. So from raw ingredient intake all the way through to packaging, all of the various quality checks that we go through to get the beer to the standard we want it to be.
Wow, that's a big walk. So the premise is that we want to have a look at our process in its entirety, right? That's where it all starts. The better you can understand your process and the more honest you are about your process, and all the different parts of your process and where things can go wrong, that's the start of it. So the first part of it is to understand what the process actually looks like start to finish, right? And then the next job that we're going to do from there is start to think about where things might go wrong. That's all the way from malt intake, and that's base malt, spec malt, ingredients coming in. What do the ingredients look like when they come in? Are they compromised coming in?
Storage conditions.
Storage conditions, right? So we're sitting on big quantities of silo malt through our certified sustainable malt, which is a wonderful thing, but that change led us to be sitting on silos of malt for the entire batch of malt.
Which is about a year's worth, right?
Yeah, it's about a year's worth of malt. So the second something like that changes, you have to be honest with yourself about how you've changed those risks. And that's what my job looks like. I'm trying to preempt what's going to go wrong before it goes wrong. And if something's gone wrong, I'm trying to spot that it's gone wrong, even if someone hasn't told me it's gone wrong. So within all that, we've got to be honest with our team about knowing what all those points look like, and make sure that our team understands the importance of all those checks that they're doing throughout. And the premise is continuing improvement, right? So that's continuing improvement right from a staff perspective, a training perspective, a process understanding perspective, and then putting controls, measures, visibility over that process, and hopefully putting something in place for every step of that risk so that we have a way of measuring it and mitigating it.
So I guess a lot of people would assume that as a quality manager, a lot of your time spent just analysing beer, but the reality of it is that it's way more in depth than that, and it's actually more about preventing risks before we end up with spoilage or we end up with the issues that you're going to detect in the lab, right? Because, a lot of our monitoring is simply that, it's monitoring, right? And it tells us when we've got a problem, but the reality of being in charge of quality is preventing those issues from popping up in the first place, which is huge. We're out here on a farm, right? We're in the middle of fucking nowhere. We've got dust, we've got flies, we've got cows around us, right? There are a lot of risks on this site. So that risk mitigation and prevention is actually integral to us creating good products, right?
100%. The lab's fantastic. We've got a great lab. It's it's one of the most powerful PCR/micro labs, I think, in craft brewing. And we're very, very lucky to have that. But the lab's a measurement tool. The lab is just one. The lab is not a silver bullet for quality. The lab is a really good, powerful measurement tool. And to be honest, if most things that we're picking up in the lab, it's too late. So we can't save a batch by having a lab. We can create measurements that give us a benchmark on whether the brewery itself is in a good spot and whether our processes are in a good spot. But the lab itself does not, in its own entity, create quality beer. It's the information that we gather from that lab and what we do with it. It's 100% a measurement tool. Quality comes from all that other stuff that how much time I spend building. It's that. A lot of it, as I say, is that honesty with yourself and our staff's honesty with us about what's gone wrong, and where it's gone wrong, and really good recording process for how things have gone wrong, good non-conformance reporting, good preventative action reporting, and good proactivity on that. The whole premise of quality systems, whether they be laboratory-based or, we look at ISO, we look at, 17025, which is your lab standard, or HACCP standards. They're all based on the same principle, right? Which is understanding your process and continual improvement. And that improvement happens at every level. So every time you pick up that something's gone wrong or something could have gone better, you've got to look at all of those levels. Was our training good enough? Did we have something in place do we have a control for that just wasn't applied?
Yeah. Did anyone actually flag it at the applicable spot, right? We're continually saying there's no problem with flagging when something goes wrong. Like we want you to flag it, be honest, be truthful, because hiding it is actually the worst thing you can do. Then that's you're not going to get in trouble for raising an issue, is basically what I'm trying to say. There's no issue with raising an issue.
Yeah. There's nothing I hate more than discovering a problem through a measurement. Because if I discover a problem through a measurement, it means someone hasn't told me something, or something hasn't happened the way it should have. Someone is the wrong term. Something hasn't happened the way it should have, whether it's a piece of equipment that hasn't functioned right, or we didn't hit a temperature during a CIP, or, we've got some control. By the time I discover something through a measurement, by the time I discover an issue through a measurement, it means that there's something else in that process that hasn't gone right and we haven't picked it up.
Yep.
So there's nothing I want to see less than picking up once a batch is in package that it's not right.
I guess the average consumer, the average punter, our customers don't really associate quality with all of the things you're speaking about. They associate more with ingredients, with flavour, with, I guess, what's in the glass. But there's so much more that goes on behind the scenes to ensure that product is safe, that it's stable, and that those flavours that everyone expects from us, they hang around for a long time, right? So we're pushing to try and get 9 months, 12 months shelf life out of these beers, where traditionally we were getting maybe 3, right?
But that's all that matters. All that matters is that what the customer gets in their glass or in their can is what they expect to get, and it's the best experience we can give them. That is the end goal. That's what it's all about. But I think what we're talking about here is that to get to that point, especially as we grow and as as our reach gets further, to get to that point, there's more and more to it every day. And we don't want to, we were making amazing beers 3 years ago, but they weren't amazing beers that are going to the same audience that they are now. So we can't keep just doing the same thing and doing more of it and expecting that we're going to reach a bigger audience like we do now to the same standards. It's not going to happen. Those standards have to lift to the point where we can deliver that experience, and it's all about that experience. It's all about that beer tasting amazing in the glass every time it lands in the glass. That's the end goal, right?
Ross and I discussed earlier in the season, in the series, I should say, just how much we've changed and adapted the way that we look at every single beer that comes through. And, he joked that every beer's been touched at least 20 times before it gets to package, right? We're looking at it daily, we're monitoring it daily, we're doing gravities, we're doing pHs, we're doing yeast cell counts, we're checking everything we possibly can. And then this obviously falls into quality as much as everything else you're talking about. This is the actual liquid quality, right? That we're then assessing and managing and trying to stay on top of. So do you want to walk me through, I guess, how much that's changed since you came into the lab role? Because when you first started, we were barely recording any sensory data. We were barely recording anything to do with the beers, let alone what we do now and the amount of checks we have.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that I saw when I got here is we were taking measurements, but in some cases they weren't worth much. The way we were calibrating equipment, the way we were, the differences in the way people took those measurements. So, and that's just my background. That's nothing to do with the brewery itself. It's just that that's the first thing I noticed when we walked in. It's like, man, we've got a pH meter on a kitchen sink. Like, what's going on with this? And we had some cool gear, but we weren't really looking at how repeatable it was or how well it was performing day to day. Cool thing was most of that cool gear was new. Which means that it was doing a pretty good job. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed with equipment over time, most of it's pretty bang on when it's brand new. But if you don't look after it and you don't watch it, you can be doing that work, you can be taking those measurements and it will change over time. So I guess that's the first thing I noticed, is making sure that the measurements that we were doing were worth doing, and making sure that the data we were gathering was looked after. Because when you look back on it, it's that data that you gather. You don't gather it for nothing, right? It's the data that tells you the story when you look back on it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of time and energy that goes into collecting all of these data points, right? So ultimately, we need to make them worthwhile so that then we can utilize them to make improvements to the products, but also improvements to the processes for the products, right?
Yeah, so once you've gathered those numbers and once you know that those numbers are worthwhile numbers, you've got to take time to look back at those numbers. For pH, for example, we track pH to ensure ferment consistency. It's a massive indicator of how yeast is performing, yeast health. When yeast is starting to drop out of solution, that the way that pH travels is our best indicator of what that yeast is doing, and the consistency that we're getting, short of yeast counts, of course, but the consistency that we're getting from a yeast performance point of view over time in our ferments, pH is the best tool that we have to track that. So we've got to make sure that we take time once we've gathered that data to actually look back at it. There's no point having it if we don't take the time to compare ferments and look at whether our ferments are tracking the same. Are they tracking too quickly? Is that pH getting too low, too fast?
Is our finishing gravity shifting a little bit over time? Have we got different malt? I mean, the malt does change over the year that we're storing it, right? So it's actually being able to make adaptive changes to the recipes as required to ensure that we're getting consistent finishing gravities so that we've got a consistent product, right?
Yep. And, if we don't look at those numbers, we don't see that. And then I guess once we've got the numbers, once we've looked at them, once we start to learn those lessons, then we start to see the holes. We start to see the holes, and we start to realise where we needed other numbers or where we needed more numbers or where there was something wrong with the numbers. And then then you start to address that from a systemic side of things.
Yeah, so it's more control points, better analysis of specifics that pop up along the way, right?
Yeah, like it can be, but it can be training. It can be making sure that everyone's gathering those same numbers in the same way and recording them. It's not always. Yeah, is it the data set? Is it the ferments? You sort of got to have a good look at all of that and make sure that you're honest with yourself about, we're honest with each other about where the problems actually lie. And sometimes that's hard, right? Sometimes it's hard to look at it and go, oh, we're actually doing this bit wrong. Like it's pretty easy for us to, it can be easy to ignore.
Yeah, be like an ostrich rather than actually accept that there's a problem in the first place.
Yeah, accept that you're doing something wrong and address the actual cause, because we've been guilty of it in the past, taking longer than we should have because we're chasing the wrong problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty important that we're honest about root cause. That's a term that I have to use too often.
Yeah.
Root cause.
Yep. But that's what it's all about, right? And that's what a quality system is about, is understanding where the root cause of the issue is. It's not necessarily about the product itself. I mean, we have a huge clearance process for every product that goes out the door to ensure that it's going to meet our standards when it's in trade. But at that point in time, there's not anything we can do to that beer specifically to ensure that it's going to meet those, because once it's packaged or once it's ready to package, if it's not fit for trade, it's not fit for release or to go out to public. So I guess that's a segue into one of my next questions, which is around the quality systems and I guess the release to market procedure that we go through, because we've touched on how we monitor ferments throughout, but then we still have obviously sensory checks along the way, and then we have sensory checks before we go to bright tank. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on what it means to go from a beer in ferment to one that is ready for us to release out to trade, and those various steps that we go through?
Yeah, 100%. So the first thing we're looking at when a beer hits fermenter is yeast counts, pitching yeast counts, right? So we want to get pitching yeast counts right. So we've got procedures, and they're pretty good procedures given the equipment that we've got. So we make sure we get those yeast pitches right when they go into tank, and then the next day we start looking at how quickly those ferments have kicked off. What's that pH doing on day one? How does it smell and taste? That's like that day one. And it's one of the trickiest nuances to get around, because you do get smells and flavours, and there's such a blend of smells and flavours at day one, where you've got some things that we definitely don't want to see at the end of ferment present at day one, but they're allowed to be there on day one, right? We're allowed to have a little bit of isoamyl or that banana-y flavour showing. There's some flavours that are just fine for us to see at the very beginning of a ferment and are completely normal, but we don't want to see those persist. So that's sensory, and there's a definite nuance to that. Everyone's that loves beer has consumed a lot of beer and knows what their beer is meant to taste like at the end, but it takes a long time to learn and to teach people and to help people. And it's sensory, right? It's a very hard thing to teach people, those nuances, but you have to help people learn those nuances, because my sensory system is not the same as the other 2 or 3 people who are checking our gravity sensory system. So it's just about helping people develop their own understanding of what that looks like. And then, so we want to track what those yeast counts do throughout the ferment as well. So we actually watch that. We don't just look at that when we pitch. We look at that at day 1 and day 2 to see what our yeast counts look like at high krausen or when the beer is at its most active. We want to see what our peak counts. That's a particularly important point to me, is to see what those peak counts look like, and particularly what those peak counts look like in relation to how we pitched the beer. Yeah, so the next thing we need to have a look at, and one of the most important things that I'm looking at when we're looking at pH, pitch rate, and those day 1 and day 2 yeast counts, those yeast counts as our beer starts actively fermenting and peaks at its ferment, is that relationship between what we pitch at and then what we see the highest suspended yeast counts get to, because that's an indication of the amount of yeast growth we're getting. And the yeast growth has a lot to do with a lot of the undesirable flavours that we might see. The production of those flavours has a lot to do with the amount of yeast growth and the speed of yeast growth. So the relationship between those numbers is really important. And as we move beyond those first few days, so those first few days are really crucial. What we're getting in terms of pH change, flavour development, and what those yeast counts are doing are really important measurements over those first few days of ferment to really understand that we're doing the right thing. Are we putting too much yeast in to start with? Are we over-oxygenating and getting too much replication and too high accounts in relation to our initial pitching rates? And, is that causing too much pH drop? So production of flavours that we don't want, all that sort of stuff. So
basically what you're saying is that the clearance process essentially starts from day 1 of fermentation.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And arguably from the brew day itself.
Well, the cool thing is that they are the couple of days where we do have time to perhaps make a change in the beer.
So you could potentially oxygenate, or you could feed the yeast if we needed to feed the yeast.
Yeah,
or there's a few different,
hold a temperature rise till later.
Yep.
Temperature is incredibly important during that time as well. And I should have, temperature monitoring is incredibly important. Temperature monitoring happens with almost every measurement we do, so I kind of gloss over it. But watching those temperatures is incredibly important as well. Yeah, so beyond that, as that yeast starts dropping out, and we watch and we make sure that those ferments progress the way we want them to in terms of going to completion. I could go a long way into how we know whether they're going to completion, but I'm going to leave that out. And then we watch and we make sure that those ferments are going to where we expect them to go. And then as they reach that point, then we're starting to have a really close look at the sensory again, right? We're starting to make sure that we haven't got sulfides persisting into late ferment and those sorts of flavours.
Yep. Definitely. So I guess once we have done that and we've determined that there isn't any off flavours, because if there are off flavours, again, there's limited recourse for us at that point in time. Some we can potentially scrub with things like CO2, but it does have a detrimental effect on the quality of the product, so we try not to. But assuming that we've got a product that is meeting sensory requirements in fermenter, what would be our next steps?
Okay, so then as we reach the end of ferment, we're starting to make sure, did the ABV, did the alcohol hit the spec that we want it to? So is that product going to be legal to go on the shelf? Is it in the right range? Has it finished where we want it to? Has that pH finished at about the right place that we want that to? Is the beer going to appear tart because pHs are finishing too low? So we're going to have a good look at those numbers and make sure that everything's ended up where it's supposed to. And we're going to have a pretty good look at the sensory, particularly dry hop beers, how they've responded to the dry hop. Do we need to rouse again? Don't we need to rouse again? We try and standardise those processes as much as we can, but you're always going to get a little bit of ferment variability. We're batch brewing. So we're always going to get a little bit of variability from ferment to ferment and a little bit of variability in hops. As much as we would love hops to be a constant, they're not. They're a biology, they're
season to season, lot to lot, even paddock to paddock, we get variations, right? So the job as brewers isn't just to go, we'll use exactly the same hop every single time in the exact same ratio. It doesn't work that way. That's where sensory comes in as such an incredibly important part. And we all perceive different things in different ways and different flavours and different aromas as well, as much as anything. I know I'm not particularly susceptible to a few of faults, but a few of our team are very susceptible to them. So, we all need to play a part in that analysis of the beers.
Yeah, 100%. And that's another wormhole we could go down, but we won't. We'll save that for another day. But yeah, learning your team, learning your team's sensory attributes, understanding who's good at what in your team.
This week's episode proudly brought to you by the Jindong Express. If this van pulls over next to you, don't get in it. Cheers.
So yeah, we've got once we've realised that the ferment's run to completion and the beer looks like we need to look at it. We're like, that's the point where we decide, yep, fine, let's clarify that beer, let's put it through the centrifuge. It's made it to that point. So it's a series of decisions, right? And it's a series of give way signs that beer sort of has to pass. All of these checks are that series of give way signs. Hopefully not stop signs. We don't want stop signs. They're just give ways.
We get them occasionally though.
Yeah. We have to have stop signs when. Yeah. When there's traffic going in the wrong direction, we need to stop, right? Yeah. But yeah, we have these series of decisions where we slow down, or where we take a little bit more time. The beer doesn't wait for you. So where we take a little bit more time to have a look at things before we make a decision to move on to the next step. And once we've made that decision that the beer looks pretty good, we move it on to clarification. There's a few measurements that we look at after clarification. We'll look at yeast counts is another thing that we'll have a look at afterwards. Clarity. We got some pretty good gear here for measuring haze, so we actually get a quantitative measurement on turbidity and how much suspended matter we have in the beer at the end. So particularly for our bright beers, we get to have a nice quantitative measurement rather than sort of how many fingers can I see through that glass, which it works.
As long as you've got the same glass.
If you've got the same glass and the glass is clean and you've got this the beer's at relatively the same temperature, all those things, it's a measurement, right? So if you're good at it and you do it well, it serves its purpose. But we've got some gear that's a little bit more advanced than that, so we can actually have a look at turbidities once we hit the bright tank, that sort of stuff. So we're looking at a gravity and pH again at this point, and it's not necessarily because that's we expect anything to change there. In fact, we don't expect it to change, but we need to look at it again to make sure something hasn't changed, right? If we've exposed a beer inadvertently, if we've exposed something to cleaning chemicals, or if we've had something go wrong in that process,
an accidental dilution's happened,
accidental dilution.
Yep. And there's many different things that could happen. I mean, again, it's a validating that you said clarification rather than filtration, which is actually really good because we put everything through a centrifuge, which isn't actually a filter in inverted commas. It's a clarifier. It pulls solids but it doesn't push it through a membrane or anything along those lines. It's quite cool, but there's a lot that can go wrong in that process. Dissolved oxygen is another one that you haven't really touched on, but there's so many different critical control points and measures at bright beer tank level that we need to check before we can clear the beer, right? Yeah,
indeed, completely glossed over that. So DO, dissolved oxygen, is something that we should be able to assume to be is relatively close to zero before we start clarification, give or take dry hopping processes. But we got those fairly tight, and it's less likely that something's going to go awry there or go wrong there. But yeah, dissolved oxygen during that centrifugation, that clarification process, that's a great point. We look at that extremely stringently. We make sure, before we even start, we make sure that the bright tanks are low enough. Oxygen's impact on beer it's the enemy, right? Apart from that little bit at the start of fermentation where you need some oxygen, from there on, oxygen's the enemy. And that's what's going to, when we start talking about oxygen, is one of those things that's going to affect that consumer experience, or, it's going to affect that beer in the glass the most.
For people who aren't super in touch with the beer brewing process, oxygen and light are the two main enemies of beer. So we always package our beers in cans or bottles so that there's no light able to get to the product, and oxygen is the big one, right? So all of our processes are in enclosed pressurized environments, and we use inert gases for all of the movement of the product. So that can be CO2 or nitrogen's commonly used as well. We use CO2 because we're able to reclaim that from our ferments, and it's also then what we carbonate the beer with as well. So it makes sense for us to use CO2 in our circumstances. But when we're measuring DO, we're actually measuring it in parts per billion. So we're measuring very, very small amounts of oxygen in that beer, and our general threshold for any products that are going out, and this is post-packaging, is around 100 parts per billion, right? Ideally, we're sitting in the 50 to 60 parts per billion zone, but our threshold for essentially calling product and saying that's no good is about 100, right?
Yep. Yeah, anything over 100 is definitely a isolate situation, and we have a bit of a think about what we're going to do with stock that ends up in that spot. On a really good day with a beer that's obviously, we get vagrancies beer to beer. We get variation there from beer to beer, and some beers hold foam better than others. Some beers just respond to the packaging process better than others. But for beers like the draft, for example, we want to see those numbers, and we can and do regularly see those numbers sub 50.
Yeah.
And they're sub 50 in can, and that's, for a beer like draft, you want it to be fresh, you want it to be popping, you want it to have that cereal malt quality, you want that to survive, and oxygen is what's going to destroy that quicker than anything else. And the crazy thing about oxygen is if it has to be real time. That reaction happens, that oxidation of those radical oxidizing species in the beer happens so quickly that we can transfer something, which is why when I was talking about transfers and clarification, it's why we look at it every point during the process, because you can have oxygen present at the start of a 100 hectolitre transfer, and if you don't measure until the end of that 100 hectolitre transfer, the damage is done. First of all, it's been diluted by beer that hasn't been exposed to that oxygen, so that level's already dropped. Second of all, you have no ability to change anything. You have no ability to change anything about the transfer. It is what it is if you don't measure until that beer's landed in the bright tank. But the second thing is if that beer lands in bright tank and you don't look at it for 20 minutes, it's already on the way back down. That oxygen is already being chewed up by the things that we don't want to be chewing it up. The damage is already being done.
Real-time analysis is incredibly important, right? And being on top of it at every single step of that process to ensure that we're keeping the beer in the ultimate state so that ultimately, said ultimately twice, but anyway, that's fine. But
it's definitely ultimate.
But really ultimate. Yeah, cool. But no, really what we're trying to do is make sure that the consumer, customer, you at home get the freshest and best product possible. So the minimum amount of oxygen, we want there to be no yeast in the bright tanks, which is why you're checking for that. We want our gravity to be stable. We want our pH to be stable. We want the entire product to be as stable as we fucking can make it, right? That's our job. And checking that every single step along the way allows us to ensure that, number one, we've got a product we can stand behind, but number two, that it's repeatable, because we should be getting that same result with every batch that comes through. And if we're not, then we have to check our process and work out where it went wrong, why it went wrong. As I say, if the finishing gravity is out by too much, why? What's happened? What's the variance in the process that we normally follow that caused that? And then it's about root cause analysis, like you say.
Yeah, and that's that whole secondary part of the system, which no one wants to know about, but I could spend a lot of time on. Beyond that, we move on to packaging, and we measure it at the beginning. We measure it throughout. We do some really stringent checks at the beginning of our packaging, and that's from everything to making sure that there's nothing on the lower rater that shouldn't be there, making sure that rinse is working, making sure there's no particles in those cans that aren't meant to be there, making sure that date codes are correct, all that sort of stuff, making sure that we can tell where the product's gone once it leaves here, all those little bits and pieces. And then we're keeping a really close eye on that oxygen. The second there's a beer in can, we're pouring those cans into glasses and getting it out to as many of our sensory team as we can to have a good look at that before the canning run continues. And we're watching that throughout the whole run. If something changes, we're going to have another look. If the line stops for any reason, we're going to take more samples to have a look at afterwards and make sure that line looks the same after it stopped to what it looked like before it stopped. So we're going to we do keep a really close eye on all of that throughout the process. And even once the beer's in can, we're looking at it immediately once the beer's in can the next day or that afternoon. If the canning run is finished early enough, we're having a look at all those same numbers again: gravities, pHs, making sure that carbonation, making sure that those numbers are hitting where they're supposed to. And then once the beer is in can, it doesn't stop. So we incubate cans for a period, which is what we call forestaging. We'll hold them at 30 to 32 degrees for 2 weeks. Have another look at them then, which is the best indication we get of what a beer is going to look like several months down the track without it being several months down the track. And then we will actually start looking at it on the road to several months down the track. So we'll look at it at 1 month. So we'll look at those same numbers again: gravity, carbonation, pH. Are they changing? The pH, all these numbers can be indicative of activity in the can that we don't want to see. Whether it be bacterial activity that might be changing the pH and changing significantly changing the flavour of the beer, or whether it be carbonation changes, which are starting to tell us that there might be some re-ferment activity, or sometimes it's not re-ferment activity. Sometimes it's continued ferment activity. The beer hasn't quite run to completely dry, and sometimes you'll see just a tiny little change, and that's fine. It'll stop again, and it'll make it that's not a problem. But we'll continue to look at what that beer looks like for months, and we now actually look at it at decreasing intervals. Obviously, we can't keep doing it every week for every beer for 12 months. Yeah. But we look at it at decreasing intervals throughout the entire shelf life of that beer. Yep. So we're going to look at it. So we get a picture of what any person who picks up any can of our beer is likely to see in our beer through its entire shelf life, right to the last opportunity they might get to pick up our beer.
From 1 month through 12 months, essentially, we're looking at that beer every step along the way. I mean, we've spoken a lot about the numbers, but there's also a huge underlying sensory program there, which is a lot more subjective than objective. The numbers are very objective, right? They are correct or they're not correct, and we've got a lot of tools to be able to ensure that the integrity of those is right. We can come back to PCR in a little bit, and you did talk about the final gravity and creeping and potentially having fermentation. I think you glossed over it earlier, but we do something called forced fermentation testing as well. So essentially understanding what the theoretical finishing gravity should be so that we can align our beers with what that is, right? And probably, we don't need to go into too much detail, but is there anything more to that you would add?
Not really. I mean, forced ferment testing, particularly for the beers that we make, is shaky ground to some degree because we are dry hopping, particularly with some of these big limited release hazies.
So if anyone who watched Ross's episode, we went into detail about hop creep and the enzymatic processes that occur that will break down the long chain sugars into simpler sugars, which then, if there is any yeast in the can, it can eat and essentially continue fermentation.
Yeah. So in that, it makes replicating the amount of enzymatic activity, enzymatic, whichever you want to pick. Yeah. Replicating that amount of enzymatic activity is difficult, right? So the premise of a forced ferment test or a limit attenuation test is to enable the beer through providing it unlimited oxygen and usually much more favourable yeast conditions than it would normally get.
Well, slightly warmer, right, than we would have it in fermenter, and it allows the yeast to essentially do what absolute worst it can do.
Yeah,
right?
If there's some sugar in there, we're going to give it every chance to eat it, and then we're going to have a look at what those numbers look like, and that becomes our benchmark for where the beer has to end up.
So moving from that into, I guess, the sensory realm, because I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask is there times where we have data that says, yeah, the beer is absolutely fine, but our sensory says, no, it's not quite right?
Oh, 100%. 100%. We make a lot of, there's no bones about the fact that we make a lot of first run beers, right?
100%.
So
it's what we do. We love it, right?
Yeah.
It's the experimentation and it's the learning that we get from that as well.
Yeah. So as part of that adventure, there's times when we're like, oh, we didn't expect that to taste like that. We're going to have a look, and we're continuing, even core range, we are making improvements. We are making subtle changes, changing nuances of those beers as we go. And the sensory program is all we have to be able to tell. I mean, the number of flavor compounds, yes, they can be tested for in beer, but there's hundreds and hundreds of flavor compounds. It can't feasibly be analytically tested. The only tool we have to have a look at to see that or to see changes in that is our sensory, right?
Yep.
So it's super important that we have a solid sensory program and that we place faith in our sensory program and back it. So when our tasters tell us, when our team who know our beers as well as anyone, arguably too well in some cases because we also become very familiar with them.
I mean, that can also be a curse though as well, right? Because we can become a little bit like, oh no, that tasted pretty okay, but we're not. You can fall into this sense of security of, oh no, but it's similar, it's fine. Not, we want it to be the best fucking beer it can possibly be, and I guess that's the role in sensory. It's to try and drive everybody to be really critical and hyper analytic of it, because it's not that we're trying to approve the beer for sale, it's that we're trying to make it the best it can be, right? So I guess how do you combat that? How do you get people to be actually truthful with their sensory analysis?
That's a really good question, because fatigue is real. Fatigue is definitely real. But our team are 100% encouraged to be, our sensory is able to be reported. People don't have to speak about, so the way we report our sensory is that it's reported in an anonymous way. So very few people will see those sensory results apart from our quality team. So there's no one's ever going to tell a member of our team that they're wrong about their sensory, which I think is an incredibly important thing to maintain throughout any kind of reporting process, but particularly with sensory, it's important that people can voice their opinions quite freely. And the other part of it is trying to educate our team and trying to standardise the language that we use in sensory so that we can tell what they're talking about.
Yep.
When someone does flag that something's not right in a beer, trying to standardise that language as much as we can.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, there's no right or wrong, but it's very difficult to know what you're talking about if it's not in some way or shape or form systemized and standardized, right? So
Right.
you're trying to teach everybody faults is a really complex process, though, and it takes months, years, decades of sensory training to get really good at picking up different faults. But when it comes to our flavors in our beers, it's more about, like, well, we have, do you like this or do you not like this test? But then we also have, is it true to target tests? And then we have essentially, there's a whole pile of different mechanisms, right? I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, 100%. But even like, you break down a beer like Gin Dong Juicy when we're trying to talk about Gin Dong Juicy, and the fantastic example for me is when we talk about tropical flavours. But what are tropical flavours?
Good question. I
You
don't know.
A tropical flavours, like for me, it goes in colours. So for me, tropical flavours can swing from a really ripe orange fruit and that really rich breakfast juicy type orange and mango type profile all the way through to what my brain thinks of as yellow fruits, or obviously one of them's purple, but the inside of it's yellow, where we start moving into those real passion fruit, pineapple, and they're all tropical, right? But they're very different spectrums of tropical. So yeah, trying to build that kind of freedom to express a flavour as tropical, but also like a language used in describing tropical within our team that we can tell the nuances between. And all of these are attributes of the hops that we're using in these beers. All of them are things that we're aiming for in different degrees, but you can have tropical flavours that will change that profile of that beer quite a lot. They're still tropical flavours. So using that descriptor, it's still true. But the beer could be quite different when it's
100%,
leaning towards an orange and mango profile to when it's a pineapple passion fruit profile. So getting that level of education amongst your team, that takes time. It takes time and conversation. I think we're pretty good at it, but I think there's room for us to do more of it, where we do more of that open conversation about flavours. And, this is quality, right? There's always room to do more. That's the whole point.
100%.
Like if you don't feel like there's room to do more, then you're not looking hard enough.
So I guess the long and short is that quality starts with the very building blocks of everything we do, which is our raw ingredients coming in, but it never ends. It's something that's ongoing. It's checking what our beers taste like and they look like in our venues. It's checking. I mean, we've done instances where we've gone around to bottle shops and we've brought beers back just so that we can have a look at them and see what they're doing. What do they taste like? How do they look at and trade? Is it mimicking what we're doing here to force age those beers? And there's so many different facets. And are we doing all of them right? Probably not, but we're learning.
Yeah.
And we're adapting and we're building and we're creating new systems, new processes to better analyze and understand what the fuck is going on in our cans. Because ultimately, we don't know if we don't know, and the only way we know is if we keep checking it.
Yeah, 100%. And you just got to make sure you keep learning. Just recognize where we're not, recognize what we're doing well, but also recognize that we always could be doing better. But within that, we've got the toolbox that we've got. We can add more tools to it over time, but at any given time, we have the toolbox that we've got, and it's just important that we use that toolbox as well as we can and recognise what new tools we want to put in it, basically.
Yeah. So I mean, we on that note, it was just after you had started with us here, we had a fairly major raw material issue, and that caused the development of our lab program, right? So
yeah, I was enjoying the brew deck until then.
Yeah,
I was actually enjoying making wort and being a brewer. That was good.
So for context, we this is back in 2021. We had a raw material contamination, which led to about 60,000 litres of beer being recalled across Western Australia. It honestly nearly sunk us at the time. It was something that was pretty catastrophic, and the worst part of it was that about 2/3 of people were blind to the fault that was caused in the beer. So we didn't detect it ourselves particularly early, where now we're aware that these things can happen, and we've got a much deeper understanding of our program. But I guess walk me through what we do now in terms of microbial analysis to ensure that we do have stability in our products and make sure that we don't have things like this happen again.
Yeah, so there's a lot of changes that have taken place since that time. From a microbial perspective, it's the microbial side of that is very, very interesting, because the particular microbe that we were talking about there was pretty difficult to screen for.
Well, I mean, even further than that, we had to go to one of the only labs in the world that was actually able to screen for it. And where were they? That was over in Amsterdam, or
was it Germany?
Maybe Germany. I can't remember. Yeah, it was. Anyway, the point was that there was only a handful of places, if any, that could actually detect this, which was pretty scary, really.
Yeah. I mean, that's the amount of chemical precursors that we're talking about, and the amount of microbes that will produce those chemical precursors throughout the range of raw ingredients that we're using. The ability for us to produce a micro program to spot everything is very, very difficult. However, there's a bunch of stuff that we can look for, and they're the stuff that we expect to see and that we see a higher risk of seeing more often. When we talk about spoilage bacteria, wild yeasts, that sort of stuff, which has led us to, since that time, very briefly, we established some internal micro programs where we started playing with plating and differential agar and that sort of stuff, which is like the old school micro methods. But to get selective enough results with those sorts of methods, it was just beyond us, which, fairly quickly led you to sort of, I remember you saying, we've got to start looking at PCR. And I was like, okay, cool, we've got to build a new lab. So ergo, here we are a couple of years later with 2 labs. So we now have a wet lab and a micro lab, which has a clean room within a clean room, and which we need, given our situation out here on the brewery. There's no point doing PCR if you can't
validate it,
and make sure that the results are going to be good. So I just glossed over the term PCR. PCR is polymerase chain reaction.
Most of you will be familiar with PCR simply because of COVID.
Yep.
And, it's essentially a rapid way of us detecting microorganisms, and specific ones as well, which is quite cool.
Yeah, so it's a medical technique that's been adapted into food industry on a fairly widespread level, actually. So it's able to give us very selective results pretty quickly, and very sensitive results very quickly, a lot more so in terms of preserving organisms that the actual test methods might compromise the viability of the organism themselves, such as putting yeast cells under vacuum, for example, to try and get them onto a plate to try and grow them through plating methods is kind of fraught with danger. Or poor plate methods, like you can actually kill the yeast can be there, but unless your methods are really, really good, you can actually kill them on the way to trying to analyse them. So
basically, this allows us to find the needle in the haystack, right?
Yeah,
and that's where we are able to detect 1 or 2 cells in a vast amount of liquid, which otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do.
Yeah. So we're able to. I forget the numbers, but it's down to the 1 in millions that we're able to detect wild yeast cells within culture yeast. So yeah, it's pretty powerful, and that gives us a pretty useful screening tool, particularly in problem solving and background monitoring. So that's where we use a lot of those techniques to keep an eye on, sort of revert back to something I said earlier, where if I discover something, or if the lab team discovers something through a check, it may be too late to fix that beer.
Sure, if there's a microbial issue, it's more than likely that we can't do anything about it. But what we can do is work out where it came from, and prevent it from happening as a widespread issue, which is where I was alluding with the reason for us doing all of this is to try and prevent the necessity to recall 60,000 litres of beer again.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, we might lose a batch or 2.
Sure, but that's part and parcel with what we do. And, ultimately we have to make those calls, right?
Yeah. But we're going to discover if we've got a persistent bacterial contamination problem, we're gonna spot that through all of these tools, but PCR is probably your quickest turnaround, right? So you would discover it through your sensory. You know, we could have an anaerobe problem, which is some of the hardest ones to find, and we'll spot it a few months down the track. But that's a lot. That's 60,000 litres.
It's too late, right?
That's way too much beer. 600,000 litres of beer. That's way too much beer that's gone through before we discover it. So the PCR is it's an incredibly powerful tool for us to spot that stuff early.
Yeah, it basically raises a flag that we would not otherwise be aware of, which is a fantastic tool. And I guess that leads me into the next part, which is, we're in the process of developing some low alcohol products, and low alcohol products come with their own unique challenges. They're not inherently shelf stable. I mean, one of the beautiful things about beer is that it has a relatively low pH and alcohol. And those two things mean that there are very few pathogens, if any, that can survive in that environment. But once you remove the alcohol from it, even though the pH is still quite low, there's a real risk there, right?
100%. It's a different ballgame. Once we start talking about controlling the risk around pathogens in non-alcoholic and low alcohol beverages, the ballgame really shifts. All of a sudden, instead of looking for beer spoilage organisms, we're now looking for pathogens. And we're going to have another whole process in terms of validating the effectiveness of pasteurisers.
Yep.
Making sure, validating the actual operation of pasteurisers at the time. And then,
so for those who aren't in the know, essentially the only way that we can ensure the shelf stability of the products, because there are very few process aids that we can use. In fact, there aren't any that I'm aware of legally anyway here in Australia that we can use that will chemically stabilise. So we have to physically stabilize, essentially, which means heat treat the product. So pasteurization, you can probably go into more detail about pasteurization units, than I can, because that's not really my knowledge center. But my understanding is that the only way for us to ensure the shelf stability is to have that product heat treated to kill any microbes that could be present.
Indeed. So pasteurisation units, I can't remember the exact numbers. I should be able to study that table. But they're representative of a product being held at a temperature outside of ideal range for microbes for a time.
Yep.
So I think, it's one pasteurisation unit is representative of a given time at a given temperature.
So in our case, we're trying to keep that temperature as low as possible for as short a time as possible to ensure that we're not cooking the beer, basically, right?
Indeed.
But also long enough and high enough that we're taking care of the pathogens that could be present. And I mean, for the beer, they're mostly going to be E. coli and salmonella, right? They're the ones that we're going to be looking at most closely. Is there anything else there? I mean, just for people at home who won't be necessarily familiar with what a pathogen is, but will have heard E. coli, which is a waterborne.
It's stuff that's going to make people sick. E. coli and salmonella are definitely the two most serious. There's a bunch there. There's a few others, but we're basically going to look for anything that's what we call thermotolerance is the main thing that we're going to be looking for, stuff that can survive in the human body. And they're the things that are going to make you sick. But yeah, if we use those two as our markers, and that's generally what we're talking about when we're talking about pathogen analysis, is we're using markers.
Yep.
So we're using stuff that's likely to be there if something's gone wrong.
Yep.
And we're looking for those markers. And by looking for those markers, we can be confident that the fairly broad host of other things that might cause a problem are not there because the markers are not there.
Yep.
We're going to be moving into... To start with, obviously, we'll validate with a lot more rigorous testing, but it will be routine analysis of E. coli, salmonella, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Listeria is something that we'll check for, but we're less likely to expect.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a range of other stuff that we're going to look at, but it's a completely different set of analysis to what we were doing for looking for spoilage organisms.
It's a different set of analysis, but the principles behind that analysis remain the same, right? So having built the facility to be able to do all of this means that it's a relatively straightforward step to be able to, I won't say relatively straightforward, but it's a step that we're capable of doing to be able to look at this and to be able to do these analysis and ensure that there's the integrity of the product.
Indeed.
I mean, ultimately, all of this comes down to making the beer the best fucking beer it can be, right? So we want to do the least amount of harm to the beer along the way to ensure it's the most stable, the best presenting, and stays the freshest, the longest it possibly can, right? That's basically what your job comes down to is make fucking good beer, make sure that we've got processes that allow for that, and we make sure that we've also got a system of recording when shit goes wrong so that we don't fuck it up again.
Yeah, like I got to try and preempt if someone's going to stuff something up, as well as realising if someone is stuffing something up, as well as discovering if someone has stuffed something up, right? It's easy.
Yeah.
Super easy.
Yeah. You just got to look in the past, the present, and the future all at once. Yeah, cool.
It's a breeze. It's a breeze. You just got to look at it, gather our numbers. It's the only way, like especially when I put it like that, the only way you can do it is to make it systematic. Record your mistakes. Look at what you do well. Look when you've done it well. Actually, look at why you did it well. You know, when you've done okay, but you could have done better. Have a look at why you did okay. Look at what you could have done better. It's about that. It's about that system, and it's about having the info there when we want to sit down and look at it, whether it's because something's gone wrong, whether it's because we're trying to do something new and look at what we've done before and look at what we did well in a new product development last time and what we didn't do so well. It's all about having that trail of where things went right and where things went wrong, and making sure that we get better and better and better and better at realising where it might go wrong, and more honest with ourselves about, you know, exactly. I couldn't imagine us 5 years ago sitting down having this conversation about no-lows.
No.
And having any concept
Definitely not.
that we were going to be able to move into no-lows without some
huge
dire consequences.
Yeah, correct. And huge changes to the way that we do things, which we were just not capable of or equipped to do at that time. It's been an astronomical shift in all of our thinking, and we're still shifting that thinking as well, right? We are all having to learn and adapt to new processes and systems that are ultimately aiming at a more stable and better product. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, you know, we keep talking about it and it's going to be a recurring theme, but ultimately what we're driving for is the best fucking quality that we can possibly have, the longest shelf life and stability we can have. At no point are we sitting here going, oh, we're going to cut costs. It's all about how do we make this the fucking best it can be, because we want everyone picking up one of our cans to have the best experience they can have. And I know that most brewers are in the same line, but I think it's really important to highlight that as small brewers, that's what we do.
Yeah. Yep. And like, it's about being able to do those things with the freedom to keep making amazing beers.
Yeah.
It's about being able to do those things well enough and quickly enough and having a good enough handle on that we can continue to produce exciting beers, new beers, do new things with confidence.
Yeah. 100%. So we had a question from the audience, and the audience being Ben, our producer, just around, we mentioned earlier changing customers and you know, that our customers have changed dramatically, which has led to essentially us going down this pathway and this journey. I guess my question is, why would it change it? Like, what's the difference? I mean, ultimately, one person buying the beer versus another person buying the beer, we still want it to be the best quality it can be, right? So why would we treat it any differently?
The further it gets, the less control we have. So the further that supply chain reaches, I'm resisting answering the question to the audience.
Yeah.
The further that supply chain reaches, the more risks we've got to be aware of. The less things become within our control. We always talk about cold chain and keeping beers cold, treating them like milk, which regardless for any punters out there, if you're buying good craft beer and taking the carton home and leaving it in your carport for a month, don't. Because it's going to be better if you put it in the fridge and keep it fresh, right? We do everything we can to try and make this beer travel further and wider and make it
be as
get
stable
there
as it
fresher
can be,
and be as stable as it can be.
Yep.
And, you know, the further it travels and the longer it's out there and the more variable the conditions, you know, is a pallet sitting in a car park at you know, the back of a bottle shop a bottle shop that we've never seen, right? Like in the early days, none of our beer was being sold through a bottle shop that we hadn't seen the front or the back door of.
Yeah.
Now it's being sold through hundreds and hundreds of bottle shops all over the country, thousands that we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what the car park looks like. We don't know what time the truck gets there or when the pallets come off.
Or if they're sitting at 40 degrees in a depot somewhere. I mean, we don't have that level of control that we used to have. So therein, we need to do everything we can to mitigate the risk that's associated with poor storage of the product, right?
Yep.
But as you said, ultimately, our aim is we want it in your fridge, treat it like milk.
Yes.
That's the best way to treat the product. And, despite us treating it like shit here to try and get the best possible sensory analysis of it. Sorry, we don't treat it all like shit. We treat certain batches and bits of the batches like shit.
Some of it well, some of it shit. Yeah. Look at the difference.
Yeah. Is there a difference? Hopefully not.
Yeah, like there's no way I would have been as conscious, even when I go camping all the time. I go up north all the time. Like there's no way I would have thought about where my beers are when I go, like before I got involved in this.
Yeah.
Now even up there, like at the end of 10 days, I want the beers I take to taste as good as they did at the start of the 10 days. I'm not leaving my cartons out in the sun. It's not happening.
Yeah.
Like, so even down to that length within a short period, or a carton that sits in the back of my car, I won't do it anymore. Like, and there's a time that I would have done that.
Yeah.
That said, we are getting better at our responsibility to make sure that those beers can survive that without looking terrible, but they're going to look better if they don't go through it. So.
I mean, fresh is always best, right? Within reason. I agree wholeheartedly. So I guess just to round everything out, it's a question I've been asking everybody, and I know it's a little bit cliche, but you're a desert island. What's the one beer that you have for the rest of your life? Assuming it can be fresh every day as well. Don't worry, it's a magic fridge.
Fresh every day. You'd kill me if I answered English mild, wouldn't you?
No, you can have whatever beer you want. English mild.
Do I have to nail it down to brand? I think it's hard to go past our Pilsner tall cans lately. Like they're looking pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, I answer differently for every episode, but I'd say right now I'd go Truma Pils.
Yeah.
I'd be a happy man.
Like I'd find it hard to live without a brown ale when the weather cools down. Those beautiful autumn sunsets without a decent porter or a brown. I'd be conflicted. Yeah. But if I was to choose one for all occasions, it's going to be a Pilsner with a bit of body, a little bit of bitterness, a little bit of malt structure there, a little bit of
enough to be interesting
from every world, right?
Yeah, enough to be interesting, but not enough that it's too complex, right?
Yeah, it's a desert island. If I feel like having 15 of them, I don't want palate fatigue.
Well, thank you very much, mate. That's awesome. I think that's...
Anytime.
Cheers. Fucking empty. There's enough in there for a sip.